That's great. You turn the light on and everyone gets quiet. I wish we had that at rugby practice with the 12-year-olds. Are we still doing a last roundup in the back there, or are we good to go? Good to go. Great. Hello, everybody. Familiar faces, unfamiliar faces, new friends, hopefully. My name is Dirk Hendriksen, and I'm a member of the board of the NAF, the Netherlands-America Foundation Atlanta chapter. And I have the honor to kick it off tonight on behalf of my 9 fellow board members. So just to make sure that you all know who they are, I'm going to call them out by name. This was not part of my written introduction, so sorry for surprising you guys. Our chairman, Bernard van der Lande, you just put up your hand. I'm sure most of us know Bernard. Oh, he's still outside, getting people inside probably. Miranda Reshaw over there. Avinash Grotens over there. Katelijn Kuijs right here. Where's Anne-Marie? I haven't seen her. Is Anne-Marie here? No? Okay. From the chamber, Martijn Asselberg, I think in the back over there representing the consulate. Michael Boot up there in the booth, I think, Michael, helping us out with the technology today. Vincent Horsting and Claire Sterk, who can unfortunately not be here today. And as I said, my name is Dirk Hendriksen. Very, very nice to have you all here for the first themed event of the NAF Atlanta chapter in 2022. We are very excited by the enthusiastic reactions that we have received following the announcement of this new NAF chapter at the Dutch consulate last year in November. Many of you have become new members or sponsors since then, and we're grateful for all the support we've received so far. And it's our aim not to disappoint you with the content and the network that we're hoping to build. So welcome once again. As you may recall, the mission of the NAF and our Atlanta chapter in specific is to build bridges between the Netherlands and the southeast of the United States. We do this with a team of volunteers who decide, who I just introduced, who dedicate their time in support of this mission by enabling the exchange of people and ideas that create appreciation, progress, and tolerance. I find it incredible how 4 months after our first COVID-impacted event, the world has changed drastically and dramatically once again. This time geopolitically, and those words, appreciation, progress, and tolerance, ring home today with chillingly increased relevance. As we sit here in the Carter Center, which among others is focused on the promotion of democracy and peace, our thoughts are with those who are impacted by the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. With those terrible events in mind, it is now even more important that we do our small part to make the world a better place. Events we are planning to offer this year are a youth hackathon around plastic waste in May, a Dutch art, design, and systems thinking event with youth heavily involved in October, and the Atlanta Design Week, during the Atlanta Design Week, and an event around water management towards the end of the year. But today we close off Black History Month with this first event about civil rights and social justice with parallels to the Netherlands. I'd like to welcome you once again to this beautiful assembly room here at the Carter Center in Atlanta, as well as those watching us virtually around the Netherlands and the United States. So thank you all for joining virtually, wherever the camera may be. A warm welcome also goes to the representatives of our sponsors. Yes, we have them, and partners. Tamira Treffers of Rabobank and your team, Jaap Tichelaar of Arcadis, Stefano Folli of Philips, Art van der Vorst of the Dutch Consulate and all your team, and Willemijn Keizer, Executive Director of the NAF in New York. We're very grateful to have you all here and to have your support in both material and immaterial ways. A special thank you goes out to Paige Alexander, CEO of the Carter Center and our host tonight, who has been so generous to bring us all together here and offer this facility to us, and to whom I would like to give the floor now. Paige, please join me. Thank you.
It is so incredibly nice to see this room with people in it. I've been here now for 18 months when I moved back from Amsterdam to take this job. And this is the first actual evening event that we have had here with food and drink. And it's it's wonderful to be here. So as Dirk said, I'm Paige Alexander. I'm the CEO of the Carter Center, and I'm honored and proud that you chose to meet here tonight in the home of the global organization that President and Mrs. Jimmy Carter established back in 1982. President Carter was really unique among former presidents, former presidents, and any of his successors as well. But he put a premium on the protection of human rights and civil rights, and not only by our rivals and enemies, but also by our allies throughout the world. So thank you, Dirk, for talking about the current situation that we are looking at now as one sovereign nation has been incurred upon by its neighbor. It's really devastating, and President Carter put out a statement last week, and he continues to call me on the phone, what are we gonna do? So it's been a very difficult time. He created the Department of Human Rights and Labor at the State Department because he really was looking to put civil rights and human rights at the center of our foreign policy. Now, I've talked to some of you tonight who have mentioned that you've never been here before, and the Carter Center is a working organization, is not really for the viewing, but the library and museum is. And I would really encourage you to come back because you can see what President Carter did during his tenure in the White House and what he has continued to do and what we continue to carry through on human rights at the Carter Center. But his appointment of numerous minorities and women to cabinet posts, federal judgeships, and other important positions is really something you can learn more about at the museum and the library. But the bold advocacy for human rights, which continues today through all of our work, dates back to his tenure as governor. And as so many of you have actually lived in Atlanta longer than I have, since I just moved back in June 2020, I will tell you that on President Carter's first speech, his first day, when he was being sworn in as governor in the Jim Crow South, he told his audience and the world, I say to you quite frankly, the time for racial discrimination is over. And it's difficult for us today to truly grasp how shocking and revolutionary a declaration like that was. But in the South, it was politically dyed-in-the-wool segregationists at the time. And sitting right behind Governor Carter at that time was Lester Maddox, who was going out as governor. And he was known and very famous for brandishing an axe handle and threatening Black would-be patrons away from his Atlanta restaurant. So that's how real President Carter felt at the time, Governor Carter felt at the time. But the future president understood then, as he does now, that more people need to understand that civil rights is a subset of human rights. And society was changing back then for the Democratic Party, and Jimmy Carter was really determined to see it in Georgia, and that the South also went with it. So as he was close friends with Martin Luther King Sr., or Daddy King, and he remains very close with Andy Young, who celebrates his 90th birthday next week, and he appointed him to be ambassador to the United Nations. So in addition, Mrs. Carter was a strong supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have guaranteed women the same rights as men, and we're still waiting for that logical proposition to be signed into law. But it's a lasting reminder that there is much that we need to do to establish protection for civil rights for everyone. So, but here in the US, even with the constitutional protections in place, civil rights remain elusive and aspirational for many people. And the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others at the hands of law enforcement, combined with a wildly skewed demographic in our incarcerated population, is just how far we remain from this country truly having equal rights. So the disparities are very evident to us in the US and in ways in cities around the US in ways that I did not see when I lived in the Netherlands. And I'm sure that as an expat living overseas, I did not see much of this. But I think there's so much that our countries together should be talking about. And that's one of the reasons I'm very happy about tonight's discussion. You know, we, all of us, have a lot of work to do. And that's why I am glad you're here tonight. And whether we're talking about Atlanta or Arnhem or Amsterdam, you know, or America writ large, we must keep civil rights and human rights at the forefront and at the top of our mind. So we have to keep the conversations going. So thank you for joining us today. And from wherever you're joining us, I greatly appreciate it. And I want to let the conversation continue. And I think we're starting with a musical interlude. Miranda. So thank you for being here and thank you for taking this topic so seriously.
I have my own special microphone. Thank you all so much for being here. So my name is Miranda Reshaw and I am one of the NAF Atlanta board members. Tonight though, my role is to provide some musical illustrations to complement the theme of this evening, the theme of civil rights and social justice. So I'm about to sing a song for you that was actually a poem. It was written by a Jewish schoolteacher from the Bronx in 1937. And in it he expresses his horror at what happened during that time. In 1939, Billie Holiday sang that song for the first time, and she recorded it later that year. She really risked her livelihood and her life by performing that song in her shows. The song is called Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in a southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then a sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your beautiful, meaningful song, Miranda. When we started thinking about this event some months ago, it was important to those of us on the NAF board to take a stock of the history of Atlanta, which most of us know as the epicenter of the civil rights movement. The place where many Black leaders, like King and John Lewis, but also lesser known men and women, like my neighbor, Sarah Howard, who will be watching us virtually tonight. They fought for opportunities that were denied to people of color for so long. Sadly, though, the legacy of racism continues to be seen in Atlanta, and the gap between rich and poor continues to widen. Therefore, we knew a history lesson wouldn't be enough. We wanted to bring someone who can connect the dots between the past, the present, and the future. Someone whose work is not only grounded in the principles of social and racial justice, but also offers tangible and practical solutions. It is such a pleasure and a real privilege to have Nathaniel Smith, one of Atlanta's brightest visionaries, here with us tonight. As the founder and chief equity officer of the Partnership for Southern Equity, he advances policies and actions that promote balanced growth and inclusive prosperity in Atlanta, the American South, and beyond. Under his leadership, Partnership for Southern Equity has created the South's first equity mapping and framing tool, the Metro Atlanta Equity Atlas. In addition, the organization led a coalition that supported the expansion of MARTA into a new county. This was successful, and it had not been done in 45 years. His work has addressed housing and economic inequality, which have led to anti-predatory lending policies, inclusionary zoning, and the creation of local housing trust funds in the Atlanta area. Smith holds a degree in urban studies from Morehouse College and a graduate degree from the New School. He is a child of the civil rights movement and an Atlanta native. Please help me welcome Nathaniel Smith.
So how's everybody doing? How's everybody doing? I promise I won't bite tonight. I promise. I'll tell you, it is indeed an honor, really, to have an opportunity to be a partner with NAF in level setting the work that you will be doing as you move forward to make the South a better place for all people. And in order for you to make sure that your steps are sure as it relates to the work that you have been called to do and this chapter has been called to do, it is important that your steps are ordered in history. And understanding that all of the challenges and opportunities that we have did not occur by happenstance, that there were decisions, things that were done to ensure that certain segments of our community had an opportunity to prosper in ways, unfortunately, that some communities of color did not. And so my hope is that from our discussion, from my comments this afternoon, it will open your mind to the people's history, and not just the history that you may have learned in history books that were primarily written by people who had a part to play in oppressing the communities that I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to move, and I have slides, of course, and we have such a great panel. I'm going to try my best to do justice to this presentation, while at the same time make sure that we have enough time for the panel to go deeper and discuss the connections a bit further. So of course, the title of my presentation is Atlanta's Journey Towards Equity, and I'm going to try to move quickly, but not too fast through my presentation, but hopefully what I will provide some additional information. So again, hey y'all, as you can tell from my heavy New York accent that I'm from Atlanta. born and raised a third generation Atlantan, and I love this place and I love the South. And I was always taught that if you love something or someone, you tell the truth. And so it's going to be a lot of truth telling that may not taste good, but all medicine doesn't taste good. And so I'm hoping that through our time together, we'll be able to have a real conversation. So quick commercial, the Partnership for Southern Equity works to advance racial equity in Atlanta, Georgia, and the American South. We do that in an intersectional way through 4 different areas: energy, growth, opportunity, and health. We also do a great deal of work with young people, working to help build and grow the next generation of youth leaders for racial equity through our initiative called Yes for Equity. We also focus on transforming not only systems, but people. We believe that true change doesn't just happen through laws. It happens through people. And so we work very hard to lead with race, of course, through relationships, working to grow an ecosystem that is grounded in the communities that are closest to the challenges that we're fighting against. And of course, we're undergird our work with data and research. We also have a set of principles that guide our work. One is that we believe that development must happen with people and not to people. We believe that public and private investment should produce incomes for people, planet, and profit. That equitable growth is the superior growth model. And last but certainly not least, that building individual and collective capacity can enable communities to lead and own the change that is occurring in their communities. No community should be a bystander in the change that is happening in their communities. We must do all we can to ensure that they are engaged. So another thing, a reformed university person, I always want to make sure that we're all on the same page as it relates to how we're defining some of the things that I will be talking about this afternoon. So when I use the term equity, I basically mean just and fair inclusion, right? It's about creating the conditions for all to participate and prosper, and even more so reach their full potential. And so when you hear me talk about racial equity, what I am saying is that a person's color should not influence their life outcomes, that we must work to ensure that the color of someone's skin does not have as much influence on their ability to reach their full potential than the aspirations that they have in their hearts. And that is the work of the Partnership for Southern Equity. So again, what I hope to do is there are many ways that this story can be told. I have chosen to tell this story through land use, through the history of land use in the city of Atlanta. The history of land use, unfortunately, provides one of the clearest and saddest pictures of the role that structural racism and white supremacy has played in communities of color, in particular Black communities in the city of Atlanta, than almost any other area. And so I wanted to take a quick snapshot in history of Atlanta's land use policies to just show you some of the challenges and opportunities that have come about as a result of this history. I also wanted to make sure that I started out by providing a quote by one of my heroes, a gentleman by the name of James Baldwin. He says that one of the things that has always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is the aversion to history. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even the past, it is the present. History is the present. And unfortunately, many individuals who want us to go backwards as a human community understand that. That is why, unfortunately, even today, there are policies being passed right now in state legislators that legislators are passing around the country to end the teaching of African American history in high schools and in public schools around the country. It is because these individuals understand that there is power in lessons that can be learned through history that will allow us to move forward together as a human family. And so if you can take away history, then you're able to make a case for equality, which is an ideal. Real change must be framed within the context of equity. And the greatest difference between equity and equality is history. Another thing that we teach our friends who choose to work with us as an organization is that policy, public decisions are just a reflection of the values of people in power. So if you have, for example, this is a picture of the Atlanta City Council in the early 20th century. Men who are, of course, providing an oath to serve everyone in the city of Atlanta. I can give you an idea, just a quick moment to think about whether their values are values that are consistent with everyone in the city of Atlanta at that time. So we must do what we can to understand that it is the values of a community that influence decision-making. Budgets are statements of values of individuals who are in positions of power. So we must understand that, and that is why history is so important, because it is out of the values of a small group of individuals that did not necessarily reflect the communities in need is where a lot of the policies that we're dealing with in the states, and in particular in Atlanta, have come from. And so as a result of that, we have to work to ensure that new values emerge that will move us towards racial justice and inclusion. So Atlanta experienced decades of both de facto and de jure segregation. So when I say de facto segregation, that means that it just happened or individual choice. When I say de jure segregation, I'm talking about government sponsored and created. Yes, in the earlier 20th century, the federal government and local governments played a role in separating communities based on the color of their skin. And the result of that still affects all of us and not just communities of color. So this is just a quick breakdown of some of the historic things that occurred that helped to really entrench our land use decision-making with a value system that was centered in structural inequity and structural racism, right? So whether it be zoning policies, which work to separate us through our housing types, or whether it be the investments in infrastructure, or whether it be the role of the Federal Housing Administration in supporting and advancing suburbanization and a minimization of communities of color to have access to capital through things like redlining. All of these things occurred over time to not only separate us as a human family, but also enforce this hierarchy of value based on the color of someone's skin, which is structural racism. And it perpetuates itself in many ways and continues to perpetuate itself in many ways in our land use decision-making. So I'm going to move quickly because I don't want to run out of time, but these are just other examples of suburban patterns, white flight, all of these things played a role. So when you, in the communities that you live in, it's not by happenstance, unfortunately, that most of them are not diverse. It's not by happenstance that if you live in the suburbs and you have to drive back to Atlanta, that you have to sit in traffic for hours. All of these things happen because of bad policies that were undergirded and advanced through a prism of bad values. So I cannot talk about this as it pertains to land use and the effects of white supremacy without talking about the 1906 race massacre, which happened in the city of Atlanta, not because of the undereducated or uneducated individuals that wanted to engage the Black community in a violent way. It was business owners, individuals that looked at the African American community as competition, who saw after Reconstruction Black men having the opportunity to vote and beginning to gain ground through economic development and corridor redevelopment. They saw that and saw that as competition. And as a result of that, with the support of publications like the Atlanta Journal, began to put out salacious stories about Black men accosting white women. And as a result of that, a massacre really occurred in the city of Atlanta, where over 100 Black men were murdered as a result of this fear and this commitment to maintaining white power in this city. We also saw other key things that have occurred. And again, when I talked about history as the present, how different is that now from the various policies that we see of different jurisdictions now wanting to become cities in the city of Atlanta? What is the difference? Wanting to separate themselves from the broader community. We're seeing that again today in contemporary times. It may not be overt violence, but I would say the spirit of that, of separation, still lingers to this day. We also know, of course, that after Reconstruction, there were many policies that were put in place that minimized the opportunity for Black people in particular to be seen as full citizens of the United States. Underhanded Black codes and Jim Crow laws that minimized the opportunity for African Americans to vote in this city or in other places around the South. Poll taxes. And not only did it minimize their ability to vote, but it also minimized their ability to serve on juries and also other opportunities for them to fully engage in the civic fabric of a community. So again, utilizing policy as a way to manifest the values of white supremacy. The poll tax. If you can't afford to pay to vote, you can't vote. People going into places to register to vote and people putting jars of jelly beans in front of them and saying, tell me how many jelly beans you have in this, I have in this jar. And if you can tell me the number, you can register to vote. These were things and tactics that were done to minimize the civic agency of Black people in the South in the early 20th century. And yes, as I said before, it wasn't just people behind a curtain locally who were mad that the South lost the Civil War. It was actually the federal government also played a role in maintaining segregation. This is a quick excerpt from the FHA Federal Housing Manual. So it says that if a neighborhood is to retain economic stability, that it must encourage basically segregation. This was federal policy, an assumption that by encouraging integration, that housing values would decrease. And it didn't just stop with the federal government. The banks took hold of this opinion and began to decide on where they should invest their dollars, which were not in Black communities. It didn't just stop there. The realtors began to steer people with resources away from communities that were considered undesirable. So everybody has had a part to play in advancing white supremacy and injustice in the South, even our federal government. And that is why it's important that all of us play a part. And so history is the present. This is an old redlining map. So basically, as a result of that FHA underwriting decision, communities were broken down into most desirable communities and undesirable communities. And as a result of that, even today, the history and ripple effect from this redlining map continues to affect our community. And so, of course, green were the most desirable communities. Red were the most undesirable communities. I'll give you 2 seconds to tell me who lived in the red communities. Black folks. So again, the policies, institutional policies to maintain in order to separate us was something that was advanced in our communities in Atlanta. And so even to this day, in Atlanta now, 80% of Black children live in high poverty areas, while only 6% of white kids live in high poverty areas in the city of Atlanta today. Atlanta is number 2 for the lack of economic mobility for poor kids, and is either number 1 or number 2 consistently for income inequality of any city in the country. This is a redlining map. And so where you see red now are places where still Black folks are focused in. But that is changing because of other challenges that we're facing. But again, history is the present. This is the Lautner Plan, a plan that was done before the Eisenhower Act that basically encouraged the segregation of communities through our highway systems, that basically enforced this idea that Black communities were not valuable, and as a result of that, roads and bridges could be built on top of Black communities in order to ensure that white suburbanites can get back and forth to the city to work. This is an example of the result of our highway system. And as you can see, the highway system in Atlanta is separated the Black and white communities. And unfortunately, there were communities that were actually where those highways were. And unfortunately, those were Black communities. So not only were Black communities separated from economic opportunity to support the economic viability of the white community, they were also built on top of in order to move this agenda forward. This was done through planning. So what I would propose to you that it's not just about doing this for the sake of doing it. When we talk about land use policies, housing policies, zoning policies, and transportation policies, all of this was done in the South and in other places around the country to either protect or expand white spaces. So what do? This is another example of a wall that was built by Mayor Ivan Allen called the Peyton Wall, that was done to minimize the ability of Black people to move in a community called Cascade Heights. The mayor of Atlanta literally built a wall to keep Black people out of a white community. Unfortunately, it was struck down as unconstitutional. But again, the protection and expansion of white spaces. Even the mayor of the city of Atlanta, a mayor that was considered more progressive, was involved in doing things of this nature. So, of course, of white flight and the suburbanization of white communities in the 50s and the 90s, again, supported by the federal government through the GI Bill, where white soldiers had access to resources to buy homes in suburban areas while Black people were not necessarily given an opportunity to do that. The utilization of gates to either keep people out or keep people in certain communities. This question about the suburbs, who belongs? Who belongs in the community and who makes that decision? That is not just a question for Atlanta, it is a question for the world. Who belongs in our world house? It is our responsibility to make sure that we answer emphatically, we all do. We all belong. One of the largest developments in our city, developed with air bridges to minimize the ability of white workers to be exposed to Black people who lived in the city at the time, Peachtree Center. The Olympics, while people were, of course, excited about the Olympics from all around the world to come to Atlanta, there was a great deal of work behind the scenes to push the poor out of the city in order to create stadiums and minimize the bad image of the city. The utilization of economic development dollars to, again, help to facilitate new infrastructure that then played a role in pushing communities out was the story of the city of Atlanta that people don't have an opportunity to learn about. So this question about the work and how resources are used in communities, the question about who benefits, who is protected, who pays, who decides, who is left behind, are key questions that we must ask as we move forward towards what Dr. King calls the beloved community. Who pays? When development authorities like the Invest Atlanta or other development authorities around the country give tax breaks to large corporations that take away resources from our educational system, who pays? Our children pay. This is a bar graph of the amount of dollars that have been taken out of coffers for public education in Georgia. A lot of those dollars were taken away because corporations and other large employers were positioned to not pay their fair share of taxes. Who decides? Who belongs? Who is protected? We have to ask these questions. As we come back to the cities through this idea of new urbanism, are we working to ensure that all people have a place in these new developments, or will they get pushed out? Will we actually use their circumstances as a way to subsidize their own displacement with projects like the Beltline and other large-scale projects in Atlanta like the Gulch or Ponce City Market? These are all places that had a majority Black population. But because of public finance and the speculation of developers and the lack of influence of the Black community who lived in those communities, they were used to raise dollars in ways that supported the beautification of those communities and better infrastructure, which then brought in new housing and new markets that eventually pushed them out. So when you go into the city of Atlanta and go to places like Beltline Park, remember that those parks unfortunately played a role in pushing out many poor folks that didn't have an opportunity to benefit from the investments that they made for years in tax coffers. What are we doing to ensure that they can stay? What can we do to move forward to make sure that we realize the beloved community? So I'll move quickly. These are just some articles about that urbanism hasn't worked for everyone. Now that the neighborhood is nice, why do I have to move? Major issue in the city of Atlanta around housing affordability and communities of color, in particular Black communities, getting pushed out of this city because now everyone is beginning to move into the city. American cities were designed to oppress. Again, juxtaposing this article with some of the history that I have lifted up, planning, development, housing policy, transportation policy, infrastructure policy. All of these policies, unfortunately, have been undergirded by values that have not looked at communities of color as valuable. And so as a result of that, many things have happened. So I'll move quickly here. As a result of all of the things that I've talked about, home ownership, 74% of white households reported owning their home. Only 43% of Black households reported owning their home in the country. Median income for a white family in Atlanta, $103,000. Median income for Black or African American households, $33,000. In a place that is supposed to be the cradle of the civil rights movement, the home of Martin Luther King Jr. These are the statistics. The evaluation of Black households simply by choosing to live together, not as valuable as white households. Challenges around Black-owned businesses. Businesses in Atlanta, the ownership, the value of it for Black businesses, $58,085. For Latino businesses, 475. For white businesses, 658,000. Disparity in having access to capital. Again, which on many occasions goes back to home ownership and where people live, which provide opportunities for them to leverage their land as a way to start businesses. Challenges around income segregation in the city and in the southern region. So the South, unfortunately, has major issues in terms of the racial wealth gap and also in terms of the economic mobility for poor kids. Major racial segregation challenges in our city. The majority of African Americans live south of I-20. I-20 is our demarcation point in this city. The majority of Black people live south of I-20. The majority of white people live north of I-20. The majority of the jobs and resources and amenities of north of I-20. The majority of the challenges in terms of the lack of infrastructure and economic opportunity are south of I-20. Again, the utilization of land used to separate us. How can we work to bring each other together? So I want to move quickly and provide some examples because I don't want to leave this with a doom and gloom synopsis of where we are, because I do believe change is possible. But it's going to take courage and a willingness to not just give. I always tell my friends, the work of equity is not built based on what you're willing to give, but what you're willing to give up. What are you willing to give up for racial equity as you begin your work here in this city? So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the great work that we've had an opportunity to do with many of our partners. This is one of my, I got some of my staff in here, I want to say one of my favorite projects because they may get upset, but this is the Just Business Roundtable. So we've been working with, for the past 3 years, corporations in our city who have made a commitment to advancing what we call a corporate racial equity agenda. Yes, the private sector must be involved in advancing racial equity. We now have over 30 businesses that are working with us to influence their contracting and procurement practices as companies, their willingness to stand up around key policy issues, and also to continue to take this equity journey together to develop strong relationships and also learn together through the Just Business Roundtable. And I'm really, really excited about the work that they've been doing to really begin the process of moving from corporate social responsibility to corporate racial equity. Also, another effort called Just Capital, where we are working with 30 Black businesses through our partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation to not only work to ensure that these micro businesses are successful, but they're also organized in a way that they can collectively engage in issues of public policy to ensure that they have access to the resources they need to be successful. You know, working to build an ecosystem. We've given over $50,000 so far to businesses locally and hope to give more to support Black micro businesses in the city. And this is one of our larger efforts called the Justice 40 Accelerator. President Biden made a commitment to allocate a percentage of climate remediation dollars to disinvested communities. We knew that that would not happen without us organizing the broader community and educating them and supporting them. And so we created an initiative called the Justice 40 Accelerator, where we're providing so far to 52 businesses owned by individuals of color around the country. We're providing pre-development dollars, technical assistance, and navigational support to ensure that they're able to compete for the resources that will be coming down from the Justice 40 executive order of the Biden administration. Our goal was to initially raise $3 million for this initiative. We're now up to $10 million. Working to ensure that businesses owned by people of color have a chance to truly compete for the resources that are provided by the Biden administration. So these are other great things that we've done, from working in the city of East Point to develop the first equity and inclusion strategic plan in the state of Georgia, to work to advocate against questionable investments by the Fulton Development Authority and the work that and how they've used those dollars to help build luxury apartments while everyday people can't afford housing. Of course, the work that was done around Black Lives Matter. We've actually have had an opportunity to work in Brunswick, Georgia, after Ahmaud Arbery's death, to begin the process of pushing a policy agenda with the faith community and other key leaders so his death will not be in vain. So, if not you, who? What is your responsibility to your country as well as the United States to move us forward as a human family? We must come together now. The bad guys are winning because we choose to sit on the sidelines. We must be willing to work together to realize what Dr. King called a values revolution. It's not about laws. It's about what do we believe and what are we willing to sacrifice in order to ensure what we believe becomes the dominant way that decisions are made. Hopefully you'll understand that your engagement is critical, not just for ourselves, but for our children and the elders who came before us to make sure that they have a better life as well. So I wanted to leave with this quote from my hero and fellow Morehouse alumni, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said that a social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. We're in the place now where we need a revolution, not only in the States, but in the world. And I hope that you will be willing to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Nathaniel. That was so inspiring. You really connected the dots there, the present, the past, the present, and I hope a hopeful future. So thank you for that. I'm sure you all have questions for Nathaniel, but we're going to keep those for after the panel discussion. So here I'm pleased to introduce to you Trevor Williams, our moderator for this evening's panel. He is the Managing Director of Global Atlanta, an online news site that covers international news related to Atlanta. He is the perfect person to lead this interactive discussion of the American and Dutch perspectives on civil rights and social justice. But before we will start the discussion, Trevor will interview one of our panelists, Jennifer Tosch, live from the Netherlands, where it is almost midnight at the moment. Is she there? Yeah. Tosh, oh, there she is. Hi, Jennifer Tosch.
Hello, everyone.
Jennifer Tosch's parents were from Suriname, but moved to the United States during the heydays of the civil rights movement, just before she was born. During her college years, after her mother had passed away, she decided she wanted to learn more about her mother's roots, her identity, and started to take courses on the history of Suriname, the Antilles, and the Netherlands. She ended up doing a summer course at the Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam and studied a semester at the University of Utrecht. During that time, she felt a lot was missing from the discourse, and it was by far incomplete. These experiences eventually led her to start the Black Heritage Tours in Amsterdam, New York State, and other cities. You might have heard from her because she was the first person to speak to the crowd during the Black Lives Matter movement on the Dam Square in Amsterdam, besides Mayor Femke Halsema. Tonight, she will share with us her insights on a deeper understanding of the past, how a deeper understanding of the past redefines Dutch culture. So Trevor, the floor is yours, and I want to welcome from Amsterdam Zuidoost, Jennifer Tosch.
Thank you. So I can see Jennifer down here, but I'm also going to kind of look at her up here. I was going to say, Kathleen mentioned I'm the perfect person. I was going to say you probably couldn't have picked a worse moderator because we're straddling the line between Black History Month and Women's History Month, and you chose a white guy to come up here and talk to you. But I do think that is it's an important point because we do need to be part of the discussion, right? We all need to learn together. I remember I've read this author, Viet Thanh Nguyen. Some of you may have read some of his stuff, like The Sympathizer was one of his novels he recently wrote. And while I was sitting there, the quote, when Nathaniel was talking about history being the present and quoting James Baldwin, I was thinking, this author said, war is fought twice, on the battlefield and in memory. And he was particularly talking about Vietnam, but I think the same applies here. History is kind of the new social battlefield in a way. And I'm excited that we get to discuss the past and the present tonight. And I'm excited to be talking with Jennifer. So thank you so much. Jennifer, Kathleen did the introduction for me, so I don't have to. And you can hear me okay?
I hear you great. I hope you guys can hear me well. I wish I could be there with all of you, but thank you for inviting me to be a part of the conversation.
Well, thanks for staying up late. One thing in the introduction Kathleen made struck me, and I didn't really prepare you for this, but she mentioned that your parents came to New York right around the height of the civil rights movement. And I wondered, was that intentional, or were there other forces at play that brought them to the U.S.?
How much time do we have? That's, of course, is a story all by itself. Well, my parents actually had moved from Aruba, where they met, married, before coming to New York in the 1960s. I'm sure they were aware of the civil rights movement going on. They moved into New York, in Brooklyn, New York. So they were definitely in the heat of what was going on as immigrants. My mother often talked about the reality of living in New York City during that time. So there was definitely, they were aware of it. I don't think the timing was their plan to come but they had opportunities in the US that brought them there.
Well, Kathleen also mentioned you started really researching your mom's past after her passing. I wasn't aware of that either. I'm curious, as you were growing up, how did you conceive of the concept of race growing up in the U.S. to immigrant parents?
Well, as a Black girl growing up in the U.S., it was a daily reality. I mean, I grew up, interesting enough, in terms of my identity development, there was some confusion because, of course, I was an American born in the U.S., but my parents both from Suriname. My mother grew up actually in the Netherlands after World War II. She was a student teacher. So I was always very aware of race and racism, and was confronted, in my childhood with that reality as well. I think for me, becoming more connected to the Dutch side of my heritage and the Surinamese side of my heritage didn't really happen in earnest until I came to live in the Netherlands.
And you have talked in other settings about how the gaps that you saw and the way that the colonial history was covered and the way that race was understood. Can you tell me, when was the light bulb moment, or when did you start really seeing that this needed to be addressed in a systematic way? Well,
it was really the I think the contradiction between the experience that I had, as Kathleen mentioned, in the summer school here in Amsterdam, where the focus was really very much about the early migrations, even before slavery was institutionalized in the Netherlands and abroad. And the experience I had at the Dutch University, where upon taking courses in, sociology, history, etc., that there seemed to be so much of an emphasis on the idea of the glory of the Golden Age, which for those Dutchies in the room will know that really refers to the rise of the Dutch Empire in the 17th century, and the reference to self-congratulating about being one of the 10 richest countries in the world. But yet what was left out of that discourse was, how can you be one of the 10 richest countries at that time in particular, and not also talk about the invasion of indigenous lands, its people, the colonization, slavery, etc. So there was a real disparity between these two narratives that I was troubled by and felt compelled to explore further.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned it as a sense of, I think you said colonial amnesia. I really liked that term. Just
Well,
as a,
the idea is that I think it's really incumbent that the Dutch society really prides itself on this notion of being a tolerant nation, colorblind. I think you asked the earlier part of the question was, what was the aha moment? Was one of the first things that we were told in our international program was that we don't have a problem with race in the Netherlands. We are colorblind, we don't see color. Racism is an American problem. And of course, that was just absurd because any nation that has colonized any other nation is going to have these problems with race, and especially when people from the former colonies move into the metropole, it's going to create tensions that were very obvious to me. So I was really surprised by that. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And of course, the introduction of seeing Zwarte Piet for the first time also was quite a shocking moment.
did your parents see themselves as Dutch, and do you think they would be able to see themselves that way now?
Well, my father still is Dutch. He's lived in the United States for over 60 years, but he never became a US citizen. So he's still, and I have dual citizenship because of that. My mother did become a US citizen and was very much connected to her Dutch and Surinamese identity. So for my whole life, I've always seen them as having really a layered heritage, not just one identity or not claiming just one.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we talked about in our run up to this event was that the idea of this transatlantic bridge, like the Netherlands-American Foundation is talking about, and obviously ideas here move across the Atlantic. I wondered, as we've had this outpouring of protests and social justice movement here in the U.S. in the wake of George Floyd's death and others that we've mentioned today, how do you see that influencing the discourse in the Netherlands right now? And I think Katelijn mentioned you spoke to the Black Lives Matter protesters there in Amsterdam, but what's characterizing the new groundswell of activism, I guess?
Well, it's a good question. I think what's really important that I position myself in one particular way is that while I'm a voice and I'm representing, my perspective as a voice, there's been a long legacy of activism in the Netherlands that I think has been sort of invisible to the majority of Dutch society. So there's this perception that the rise of the activism around the death of George Floyd, and of course the global solidarity movement that has ensued, that's when it all started. And for the 10 years that I've lived in the Netherlands, and for decades before that, there has been, of course, the early women's movement. I would be remiss if I don't mention that, where the discussions about the intersection between race, class, gender, sexuality was already foregrounded, that I speak because of them, because of those early movements. And what I think what the whole Black Lives Matter movement global did was amplify what was really the deeply rooted problems around the world that were now being focused on, or people could see this live, news feeds around the world. And one of the first things that I mentioned in my opening was that racism is not an American problem. It's not an American invention. That I think during my tours, what probably surprises a lot of my Dutch guests is that the development of the construct of race started in the Netherlands and in other European cities. And we pass along these historic sites that we call sites of memory, where race was being theorized, was studied, scientific racism was developed in the city center, and then the theories traveled around the world. So there's a bit of I think, an illusion that that while we like to see ourselves as this colorblind or non-racial nation, that's far from the truth.
Yeah, I remember just one of the other reasons I feel unqualified is I remember being in Nuremberg on a journalist exchange, and the topic was memory and remembrance. How do cities remember their past, and in an honest way, but in a way that moves the conversation forward. And I remember being I think a 25-year-old guy right out of college at the time who grew up in Georgia, but only kind of knew the Sunday school kind of answers about the civil rights movement. And I just remember feeling like seeing the place where the anti-Jewish laws were codified into law, and thinking about Black soldiers going to fight for their freedoms and then coming back to their home. And that struck me for the first time, really, coming back to their home and not being able to experience those same freedoms that they were fighting for, and having to experience the same type of racism that they were fighting against. So yeah, I mean, it's an exploratory exercise that we all have to go through, but some have to go through it more quickly than others. I wondered if you could talk about how you think about history in that same context. How do you think about the preservation of historical sites and using those to activate action? Because here in the South right now, obviously we're going through this discussion about Confederate monuments, and I think the same has happened in the Netherlands. What's your approach on your tours? I mean, is it contextualization instead of removal, or how do you think about that?
Well, I often call myself a time traveler, because I live in the past, which seems like a strange conundrum, but I really do focus on exploring the complexities and the layers of this very deep history in the Netherlands. And one of the things that makes, I think, Amsterdam and the Netherlands quite unique and beautiful about it as a country is that it is very well preserved in the past. The buildings are preserved in this very 17th century architectural history, the monuments, the national buildings as well. So there's a lot to see when we're traveling through the canals. And so it's contextualizing what the symbols mean on the buildings, the gevelsteen or the gabled stones, the Black presence that's very visible on canal houses that were used like signs of wealth and status, etc. So I think I do narrate the experience, but you can see it for yourself. And I think also the work that has been done by my colleagues in the Mapping Slavery Project and other amazing historians and researchers who've done a lot of that research before I even arrived in the Netherlands has helped to contextualize that. And I'm of the mind that if we take everything down, then we're in the danger of erasing history. And that there are certainly these conversations in the Netherlands going on that I'm a part of, some of them, is how can we use this preserved architectural history to teach the generations to come and the present also as well. So I think there is ways that we can do that. There have been efforts and there are ongoing efforts, and how can we add new symbols or new signs to these historic places so that people understand what does it mean when you're passing it by, or when you see it and you're looking at it trying to figure out what is it, why is it there? Yeah,
I think it's so interesting that you use that term, erasing history, right? Because that's exactly the folks who are against removing these monuments of the Confederacy are saying you're erasing our history, right? But they don't say who our is, right? And I think it's an interesting kind of discussion to talk about history as a place where we need to, like Nathaniel said, drive for more inclusion of the historical story that we're telling. And I work on Auburn Avenue now, and I walk down that street every day, and I'm starting to notice more of the context around the buildings and around that area of Atlanta that was so pivotal to the civil rights movement.
Sorry, Trevor, to interrupt you, but I think the thing that I emphasize about what makes the Netherlands particularly unique and interesting in that context is that there are so many symbols of the past that not just celebrating the heroes or the people who committed great crimes against humanity, there's a statue in the city of Hoorn, a man named Jan Pietersen Koen, who many of course, the Dutch in the audience will know. And that's been a contested statue for a very long time. There's been some debates about, should we remove that statue? Should we keep it up? But there's been other ideas that have come up, like adding new statues surrounding Koen of the resistance fighters who fought against his invasion in the Banda Islands. That would change the narrative, certainly would create a different dialogue. But there's also people who just don't want to be remembered or want to glorify these symbols. So there's not a clear cut, should we keep them, should we get rid of them? It should be a process of really exploring how do we use this very deep history to tell new stories, to be able to allow other voices to speak back to history. And one of the central questions I ask is, what is the future for the past? What do we do with this colonial nostalgia that nationalism often is centered around?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've got one more question, then I'm going to bring the rest of the panel up. But I wondered, I thought it was very interesting that you characterize this as our shared history. It's not, it is Black history, but Black history is our history, right? It's our collective history as well. And so you talk about, when we're discussing these very real issues, it's not us preaching at you, you phrased it as walking through a doorway together. And I really like that as an analogy to what we're trying to do tonight. And I appreciate that. Can you talk more about that approach?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people appreciate is that my intention is not to demonize the Dutch heritage or to demonize what, Nederlanders are proud of, but to add, to the story has been incomplete. So my intention is to tell other sides, to look at it through a different prism, to explore it, and also to deconstruct it, because we are still unpacking a lot of this. I think the notion that racism is very viable and visible in the Netherlands surprised a lot of people. But the fact is that this is where we are today, and it's been a long history of the struggle that started in the women's movement, that continues and will probably continue into other generations to follow. So my approach is to tell, to share a narrative that might not be familiar or known, but also to use history and the production of knowledge that has tried to be critical about this to make it more accessible. Because a lot of times, academic texts are very, use language that's not easy to understand. So that's my approach. And the last 10 years almost, I hope it's made a difference.
I think so. Well, thank you so much. I think, Jennifer, you're going to stay on, so you'll be part of our panel as well, so you can chime in again. But I wanted to bring up the rest of the panel so that we can get to that discussion and also have a chance for the audience to interact with us. I'm going to ask Nathaniel if you might come back up. You've already gotten introduced, so that's good. And the other two panelists that are going to join me, we've got Laurens van Doeveren, the Deputy Consul General for the Netherlands, took up his post here in Atlanta in September 2021, right? Smack in the middle of a pandemic, an easy time to be a diplomat in a new place. Welcome, Laurens. And we're going to talk about his role a little bit more as we get into it. And then we've also got Yvonne David, who's going to come up and join us, I hope, who's the Executive Director of the Pippin Project. And we're going to talk with her about what she's up to. So I'm going to move, and then we'll jump into the discussion and go from there. So hold on one second. All right, hopefully this mic works. Can y'all hear me okay? Good. Yeah, I feel like I'm at the United Nations here, so maybe a little buzzer or something. But Laurens, I wanted to start with you, maybe down at the end of the table there. You're representing the Dutch government here in 5 states, but you before doing that here, you served as International Migration Coordinator for the Ministry of Justice and Security, and you've been part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2016, and you've also got some political experience. But tell us a little bit about how the Dutch government is approaching this issue of multiculturalism, particularly when it comes to your foreign policy around the world.
Thank you, Trevor. That's a very broad question.
Yeah.
Before I start, because otherwise I might forget it. I want to thank the Netherlands-American Foundation.
Yes.
I mean, they've been just starting a few months and have been putting off a great event in their first months on such an interesting topic. I'm Laurens van Doeveren. I moved to Atlanta half a year ago, so my wife and I are fairly new. Part of our job is to forge new partnerships among our businesses and to reach out to them and to connect them to businesses in the Southeast, but also knowledge institutions, universities, and local and state governments. You've asked a very broad question,
Yes.
Multiculturalism. The first notion, and it might sound like a very small remark, but it's actually very much at the heart of our foreign policy, is when we discuss civil rights, it's about all people of all backgrounds, race, but also very much sexual orientation and religion. That's something that we cannot stress enough, and then I think that's very much at the heart of our foreign policy. Multiculturalism is a difficult concept, and I'm also here on stage because we feel that having a dialogue also on more sensitive topics is better than having no dialogue at all. So that's very much part of our work, and we do not shy away from those debates. We've tried to embrace multiculturalism, I would say. It's also very much at the heart of our work. I am mainly in economic diplomacy. There's a global fight for talent. For companies to relocate, the first question you usually get is, where's the workforce? Where are the people? Having a global and diverse outlook helps to attract businesses and to keep your talent where it is. Because people want to be in an open, safe environment. And we also believe very much that in organizations itself, it's good to have critical thinking, people from various backgrounds, whether they are African American or white, or they're from a certain religion. Within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'd like to start there because you always have to start with yourself when you're trying to do something around the world. We very much have a policy of diversity because we think diversity of thought and having people from various backgrounds helps just outperform. So also, it's not just from a moral point of view, but also from any point of view, it makes sense to have a diverse community, and we try to embrace it as much as we can. In our work here in Atlanta, I would say the main part is we have been, we try to understand the region as much as we can, and I'm still learning day by day from all of you here on stage. And we always make sure that when we bring delegations over, we have people from various backgrounds to show them the main diversity that's here in Atlanta and a wider region. We try to recognize the contributions of African Americans specifically, but also others, trying to do outreach to historic Black colleges. I don't know if that slide can be put up. I don't have a full presentation, I'm not a keynote speaker, but can I ask I want to name one prominent example of something that we do. I'm asking the operator if they can put up the slide, if that's possible.
I'm not sure if it got put in, but why don't you start describing it and then there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, this is it. I wanted to start with this example because I can talk about the thousands of my colleagues working on development aid around the globe in many regions where we try to provide access to healthcare. I think, Nathaniel, you mentioned that your policy reflects very much your values. One of the things that we've tried to do since the Second World War is to spend 1.7% of our total GDP, everything that we earn, on development aid around the globe, especially trying to help minorities and trying to help minorities, trying to improve access to healthcare, trying to improve financing for small businesses, and trying to find ways to fight in poverty.
And you tie your aid and your trade together, which I think is very interesting.
Yes, I'll come to.
We can talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I wanted to show one example that I think was especially relevant for this crowd and for this evening, as the home of we see the home of the civil rights movement. It's a picture, and I hope it can be put up for 1 sec. It's Pastor Matthew Brown. One of our offices is named after him. He was a World War II veteran of color, an African American who helped to liberate the Netherlands. Not many people in the Netherlands know this, but there were actually quite a few thousand soldiers of African American descent fighting to liberate the Netherlands. And that's a story, one of just one, and it's a small example. It won't make a huge difference, but every step is one. we invited Matthew Brown, who participated in the liberation of the Netherlands, to visit our country when we celebrated 75 years of freedom from Nazi Germany. And I'd like to share one quote with him when I was preparing to be on stage. When we asked him to come over to go to the Netherlands and share his story and meet the King and Queen, and by the way, the King and Queen of Belgium were also there. My colleague from Belgium is actually in the audience. He said, when he was invited to come over, he said, "I have my high school diploma in one hand and military orders in the other hand. I was drafted into the United States Army after graduating from high school. The year was 1943, and we were embedded in World War II. 67 years later, I find myself on my way to the Netherlands, and I'm 97 years old." And this is just one of the examples where we try to recognize also in our foreign policy with maybe small contributions, not just, we do it on a macro policy level with spending development aid, but I thought this was like a very good example how we try to involve the African American community into our work in Atlanta, and how we also try to showcase their contribution in the Netherlands, especially on such an important topic.
Yeah, I remember being listening to a panel with your ambassador. I don't know if he's still the current ambassador, but talking about the effort to find the descendants of those Black liberators who had been in the Netherlands. I think there's hundreds at least buried in one of the cemeteries in the Netherlands, and the effort was to find their descendants here in the South in particular. I think there were 150 or so that just in Georgia.
Can I interrupt just for a second? I don't know if I'm still
yes. Okay,
on the
sorry.
screen.
Yes.
I think this is a really interesting dialogue. I not to be to interrupt the flow of it, but I'm just curious because one of the things that the U.S. and I really appreciate about the presentation is that you had so much data to show how social inequality and racism and redlining, if we were to flip that to a Dutch context, the Netherlands tends to not have that kind of data to support what actually happens in country. And I think that's one of the challenges of fighting systemic and structural racism, is that we don't have the statistics to verify what, the lived experiences of people who are non-white living in the Netherlands. In almost every war the Dutch have fought, there has been a Black presence. While I appreciate, Laurens, you're talking about the African Americans who fought to liberate the Netherlands, there are Black Dutchmen who came from Suriname, who fought in Suriname, who are still, I think, in some ways, asking and demanding for recognition for their role. So there's a bit of an inconsistency sometimes when we talk about the Netherlands going out of the country to do this development work. But when we're talking about within the country, there's a huge gap, I think, that still needs some work. And I think it's wonderful that we are so committed to global solidarity. But if you are living the lived experience of a non-white person in the Netherlands, and my family's been in the Netherlands now for almost 4 generations, so I know I'm speaking for them as well. This is not the same reality, and it comes across as a real disconnect. I think it's important to make that point.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that, because I think having the data laid out there is given that we have still such a large Black population here in the South, it's pretty easy to see the disparities. It's not, I would imagine, as easy to see in the Netherlands with the population, with the demographics.
That's my point. It is easy to see if you're willing to see it. The Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, just this last year made a declaration that I think was the first for any that level of leadership, that he admitted that there is systemic racism in the Netherlands. But he stopped short of saying that there is no structural racism, which it seems like, okay, how can there be one without the other? Well, one deals with societal racism, the everyday microaggressions and the experiences, but the other deals with structures like the government and the systems that are in place. So there is this sense that, okay, the Black Lives Matter movement helped to amplify issues. A lot of people don't know that just a few months before George Floyd was killed, there was a man named Tommy Holton in Zwolle, the city of Zwolle, that was murdered by the police almost in the exact same way. So there's a blind spot, I think, that we still have to confront when we're talking about what's happening on the ground here.
Yeah, I wanted to actually bring Nathaniel in on that point. It seems to me we write about Atlanta's growth and development connections around the world, but it strikes me as I continue to learn more that we're not writing the full story either, and we tend to tell the story of growth and progress when it comes to the economy, and it's almost like the civil rights story gets co-opted as a marketing tool. And you've written about the Atlanta way versus what you call the new Atlanta way. And I wonder, this kind of goes to Jennifer's point about dissonance and how we think about these things. What is the Atlanta way for our Dutch crowd, and how do you think that needs to be tweaked in the current day?
Well, I would say that before I answer the question about the Atlanta way, I think it's also really important to also lift up a concept called the New South, which was created by a gentleman by the name of Henry Grady.
I'm a graduate of the Grady College of Journalism.
Oh, really? Well, I went to Grady High School, now Midtown High School. So, and basically, what Henry Grady was attempting to do was to encourage Northern business to come back to the South after Reconstruction, with basically a lie that the South had moved beyond race and racism, and that Black folks were doing really well after Reconstruction, which could not have been further from the truth. The barbarism that happened after Reconstruction, in particular after the North left and left Black folks to their devices, was unspeakable in terms of how policies were used to advance prison labor, all of these horrible things that I don't want to focus on. But the New South concept is really the father of the Atlanta way. And what I mean,
is the historical, like what year was it? 1870s?
Yeah, 1870s.
Okay.
Which also was supported by a speech by a gentleman by the name of Booker T. Washington, who spoke at Piedmont Park and basically said, white folks, leave us alone. We don't need your help. We just do our own thing if you just give us an opportunity, which again, in my opinion, did not really, was very naive in understanding what white supremacy really had, the power of white supremacy on the Black community at the time. But with all that being said, I just want to provide that context. He was
challenged on that by his contemporaries
He was. Du Bois and other great leaders, Marcus Garvey as well, later on. But with that being said, the Atlanta way is really this attempt, really, by the private sector in particular, to have a really unbalanced influence on the civic affairs of the city, to the point where real hard and challenging issues in the city are made to be invisible to the decision makers, and even more so that those voices that are suffering the most are rarely in the room when big decisions are made. So when it's time for civic, so for example, the Olympics, or if we have an issue around poverty, usually in the past, the Atlanta way was a small room with the white business elites, along with a small group of Black business leaders who were invited but didn't have real power, along with the clergy, to come together and come up with something that would not necessarily make the problem better, but to basically market it in a way that will encourage people to take their eyes off of what the real problems are. So the Atlanta way was really this insular approach to dealing with civic strife and challenges that we're facing in the city, while at the same time focused more on marketing than meaning, right? So this whole concept about a new Atlanta way is really about how can we own our history. I mean, that's always one of the biggest challenges of economic development, is that you're supposed to sell, right? Your responsibility is to get business in, to increase the tax base. But it makes it difficult for you to be honest about some of the statistics that then I looked it up. But the challenge is that without lifting up those statistics, then we're not able to leverage the talent in those communities in a way that could position them to actually make us more competitive, right? So we're actually fighting an economic development war with one arm tied behind our backs because we're losing so many of our talent behind as a result of structural racism and poverty, right? So this new Atlanta way is a more inclusive way. It is a more courageous way. It is a way that we must move forward that sees everyone as valuable and no one as a liability. And it's also about making sure that the work that we're doing, whether it be from an economic development perspective or from a domestic policy perspective, is centered in this commitment to repair and healing,
Right.
And not profit and extreme extraction exclusively.
Yeah.
So
I want to maybe come back to some of that, but I wanted to bring in Yvonne as well. We're talking about the private sector and the need for both involvement, but also real engagement. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Pippin Project, what you're up to, and how you came to this realization that you really need to incorporate these racial and social justice initiatives into the way your family's company operates.
Yeah, it was 2020, perfect storm. We were all at home and we were all disrupted. And I had a lot of time to think after what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor. And it hit me really hard. And, my husband and I, we were thinking, this is a time in history. Are we going to sit in silence? Are we going to be complicit? Are we not going to do anything? And then we said, okay, so what can we do? What role do I have as an immigrant? What can I do? But what spurred us on, what spurred me on was we have two kids. They are adults, but they look at us, right? So, and another reason that is all this came together was a very sad event. My husband lost his mom. He started his company with his brother, and they wanted to honor their mom's legacy. So through a lot of brainstorming, crying, and what have you, we said, okay, how about if we bundle all this and the outrage and the sadness, and we bundle it and we're going to do something. And what we did, we chose two historically disadvantaged groups to support. And that one is the older teenager, and the other are people who were formerly incarcerated and who are now re-entering the workforce, and they're looking to get a job. And the company that we have, it's Holdash, and it's a technology recycling company. So for us, we said, okay, so we have access to laptops. So that is our field. How about we donate laptops and iPads and tablets to these older teenagers and to these people who are predominantly Black here in Atlanta, who are trying to get a second chance. And we partner, so I partner with the Pippin Project. I partner with, on the one hand, for the kids, I partner with high school school counselors and the social workers, because they identify who are the children who, during the pandemic, especially when we found out that we are dependent on technology, who are going to be without a computer the moment they leave school. So we have two boys, we are able to buy them laptops. Not everybody can. So we said, we identified that gap. We talked to the schools and we give the laptop to those children. The other hand, I liaise with Georgia Innocence Project and Georgia Justice Project. They work with people who are re-entering the workforce. They're giving them second chances. And that aligned with our mission to give people a second chance, a second start. They paid their dues, and Georgia Innocence Project, these people were in jail in prison for no reason. There was something wrong in the system, and now they are trying to rebuild their lives. So we give them laptops so that they can talk to their parole officer, they can talk to their families, they can upscale, they can retrain. And for the kids, laptops we give them because then they can get a job if they don't want to go to college or apply for college or chat with their friends.
Yeah.
So that's what we do. And what we have done with Whole Dash is that Pippin project is part of our strategic goal. We give back irrespective of what the bottom line is as a company. We have made that commitment that if I get a call from Mike from Georgia Innocence Project or from Zandria from Justice Project, and they say we have a person being released, I want to be able to say, sure. In fact, I have 2 iPads lying in the car right now to give away. So
well, could they both come back to the Netherlands? I think we need you more here.
Well,
we can do something.
I definitely want to maybe circle back. I want to open it up to Q&A very quickly, but I wanted to maybe circle back to, when we're talking about inbound investors, particularly coming in from the Netherlands. This is something I write about a lot, so I'm a bit biased, but how do they kind of grow their consciousness about understanding the historical underpinnings of the things we're talking about here. But before that, I wanted to ask a political question, and not to be inflammatory or anything, but I'm just curious, Nathaniel, I really want to open this up to everybody. It seems like there's a disconnect between the way that political hurdles have been put up here versus in the Netherlands, or maybe there's not, I don't know. But it's interesting to me that we've had Black leadership in Atlanta for quite a long time, since the 70s, I think. Whereas I'm not sure it's ever going to happen in the Netherlands just because of the demographics. So I just wondered if we could talk about, how the voting rights becoming such a flashpoint issue here in Atlanta. Is there anything we can or any way we can triangulate connections between Atlanta and the Netherlands on the political issue, or is it just too disparate?
Well, I think it goes back to the point that I was trying to make, and Sister was trying to make as well, about colonialism and domestic white supremacy are 2 sides of the same coin. They both come from the same place, and it primarily is centered around making sure that certain groups can maintain and control their political and economic power in a particular community. One community use colonialism to enter into other people's country and take their natural resources and use that to grow their communities. In the utilization of chattel slavery was actually the taking of slaves and to use their labor for free in another country to grow an economy that was based on slavery and free labor. So it's all, connected. I think that for me, the bridge is really around our shared destiny, right? As a community. And, one of my heroes we talked about Women's History Month is a woman by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was out of Mississippi. And she used to always say that, we're not free until everybody's free. Right. And so I feel like we all have to have that attitude. And when we look at Atlanta, and that's why I'm always clear with people, when I talk about race, in particular racism, I'm not talking about exclusively the color of someone's skin. I'm talking about a political and cultural construct, right? And that political and cultural construct can be advanced by somebody white or Black. Right. And what we've seen in the city of Atlanta through over 40 years of Black mayors is that, unfortunately, we've had more mayors that have focused on maintaining white power and privilege than Black liberation, in particular poor folks in this city. And we have to be willing to hold those people accountable and not hold them up just because of identity or racial politics. And so again, I think that it is connected, because for me, it all boils down to, are we going to be able to move forward both domestically and globally if we continue to allow a system that continues to perpetuate one group of people success at the expense of others? And as we become more and more diverse, in the transatlantic community, they're becoming more and more diverse because of immigration, and even more recently, and I don't know if folks have been following this, in the Ukraine, that yes, they're fighting for, through their own self-determination, but there are also some major issues that are beginning to emerge around race in the Ukraine, where Black folks who live in the Ukraine aren't being allowed to leave. They're not being invited into other countries because they are Black. And that is one of the stories that is beginning to come out. So again, it's not just an American issue, it's a global issue.
And so it sounds to me like representation, obviously very important, but also even when it's someone of another race in power, it's more about the ideas that are espoused.
That's right, the values, right? The values, right?
Laurens, I think you wanted to say something. I mean, you've got a lot of experience with immigration, and I know that's been a hot button topic in the Netherlands over the last few years. We're not going to leave it with doom and gloom.
No, definitely not. We're always forward-looking, and we try to learn from. I know we're not perfect as a country. Also, in response to Jennifer, we still have a lot to learn ourselves. Every country has to reconcile with its own history. There are some positive, but also some negative elements in our history. But I would say at least we try to make an effort and learn from it and have an ongoing debate about it and dialogue, because that's the only way forward. And at least in our foreign policy, we try to be especially vocal on minority rights from all different groups, as I've mentioned. The voting right issue that we just spoke about is also very new to me. And when you ask me, like in the preparation, are there any comparisons between the Netherlands and the United States Southeast? Yeah, I've run for office a few times. I've been on the losing and on the winning side, so I've seen both sides. I've never really questioned the outcome of the election, because our system is a bit more straightforward. Once you're 18, you're automatically registered to vote. You get your voting ballot, and you show up for the polls. You show up to a polling station, and you vote. And in national elections, our turnout is roughly about 80%. So 8 out of 10 Dutch people vote. I think that's a very clear system. I've become used to new concepts such as gerrymandering, integrity of elections, who can vote where, polling stations open. I've never seen those debates on such a large scale back home. But I think from someone who has voted in every election, and I've pretty much voted in every election, I try to be a good citizen, but also run for office. Our system is fairly straightforward, and I've never really questioned it, because you're all automatically registered to vote, and most people do vote. Obviously, there are some differences between areas, but no one really questions the opportunity of being able to vote. And that's basically part of the debate that you have over here in the United States Southeast.
Yeah, and I know the Carter Center has been vocal on this issue in recent years as well. I think Jennifer wanted to say one more
comment
thing
about the voting just before you go to the public.
I'm just going to tell people what they're doing.
I know. I just have to say that.
After Jennifer's done speaking, whoever wants to go ask a question, find one of the microphones and identify yourself and ask a question to all the panelists. So go ahead, Jennifer, sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important for the audience is certainly for the friends and family that are, viewing, that are in other parts of the world that may not understand the relationship between the Netherlands and the United States. There is a disparity. The first political party founded by a Black woman by AIM, Sylvana Simons, is the head of that party. And of course, it's in Parliament. There's a really confusing, and as being here just 10 years, I'm still trying to figure out the Dutch political system. I think there is a question of not does everyone have access to be able to vote, but representation. So if you have one person who is dominantly, non-white in Parliament of how many seats in Parliament, representation is always going to be an issue. And while we don't have the same type of political system, there is a reservoir or even an ocean of unacknowledged history. This is part of what I often try to advocate in the work that I do, the unacknowledged reservoir or ocean of history that is still, I think, keeping us from making the kinds of leaps or bridges that we're talking about. We're making steps. Granted, cities are just starting to, in the Netherlands, apologize even just for their role in slavery. So there's been a lot longer history, I think, of progression of social movements around racial inequality in the United States that has traveled and influenced the Netherlands. But I think we are seeing far more because of social media, because of kind of global events like what's happening in Ukraine. And I'm glad you mentioned that there are definitely the role that race is playing. I find it very interesting how the media is playing out with telling the stories where we see, immigrants from countries like Afghanistan and African countries that are being pushed literally to the back of the train to get out and to get support. So I just want us to balance the dialogue and the discourse with that there is no utopia. There is no such thing as a Dutch utopia. It doesn't exist. Multiculturalism was was a failed experiment in a sense. We want to believe it, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, the melting pot is a work in progress as well here. But I wanted to ask Yvonne, since we don't have anybody at the microphones, we got the Consul General going. It's a plant. It's a plant. Watch out. Go ahead. I'll come back to Yvonne because I want to end on a good note here. So.
And thank you, Trevor. Just to say to Jennifer, I'm a co-worker of Laurens, so I think it's great. This evening is already a reflection of a conversation. And Jennifer, I'm also representing you here in the Southeast. And what I think, what I've learned, because we have come here not only to bring things, but also to learn. And maybe you can reflect a little bit, all participants, because we talk about diversity and inclusion. And we do that in our office, not only by dedicating one office to Pastor Brown, we do that also to Suriname liberator, and a great during World War II, hero for the Netherlands, Anton de Kolk, who is a descendant also from Suriname. So Suriname is also represented in the Netherlands consulate here in Atlanta. But my conversation is a little bit more that I would like to hear is about my struggles to overcome the rural and the urban divide. If you talk about inclusion, and also in the Netherlands, it's very easy to do that in the cities. But if you go to the countryside, it's quite hard. And if I'm in Georgia, I find myself quite stuck, just like 5 miles, talking about diversity and inclusion. So maybe you could reflect about it, and also maybe you have some tips for us that we can learn and bring back to the Netherlands and move that discussion forward.
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear was there a question that was addressed to me in the first part, because the volume was so low, I didn't hear it. So if you had a question for me in the first part, could you repeat it?
No, it's also to the whole panel.
Okay.
It is all about the rural and urban divide, and I'm very interested if you talk about inclusion, how do you do that? And if you want that conversation to keep going, you need to include, and I see the struggle, especially in the rural side, also in the Netherlands.
So I'll just talk quickly. So the Partnership for Southern Equity, we do a lot of work in rural Georgia. And the same way that you provided an example of how Black leadership can play a role in perpetuating white supremacy. Unfortunately, we can see how in rural areas, on many occasions, white supremacy is hurting white rural people as well, right? So it's not just that Black people are being hurt by white supremacy. White people are being hurt by white supremacy as well. Case in point, in rural Georgia right now, many hospitals have closed, rural hospitals have closed because of this cultural belief that taking money from one of our previous presidents was un-American. And as a result of that, hundreds of hospitals closed around the country in rural areas, and in particular, about 5 hospitals closed in the state of Georgia. And so now in some of these rural areas that were majority white, if someone had a life-altering situation, a heart attack, it would be better for you to take them to the morgue than try to drive them to the hospital, because they don't have any hospitals in their communities anymore, right? You have these examples of people voting against their own best interests. Why? Because they've been brainwashed to believe that the color of their skin makes them a part of a club that really in reality doesn't give a what about their life experiences, right? So we have to understand again that when I talk about structural racism, It's about how do we make sure that all of us have a chance to disrupt. You know, when I sit in traffic in Atlanta, I don't sit in black traffic. I don't sit in white traffic. But we sit in traffic in Atlanta because some suburban counties wouldn't allow MARTA in because they were concerned about Black people coming, right? So we all suffer as a result of it. How do we create a bridge with the rural community? The same way that I talked about today in the worker partnership for Southern Equity in rural areas is history. It's about creating the room for everybody's history to matter. It's about ensuring that we use history as a point of departure for reconciliation. And not only reconciliation, but also understanding how we all have a chance to make the lives better of the people that have been affected by the unfortunate decisions that were made in the past. That is a lot of our work in rural Georgia. I mean, we've had work around racial equity in rooms with no Black people in the room or Latino communities or communities of color. And we've leaned on history. And that has helped us a great deal in moving the work forward. So we have to have the rural voice at the table. Why? Because that is the only way we'll be able to move forward is everybody, if everybody's at the table. So.
Anybody have anything really quick to add or any other questions? Hurry to the
I
microphone.
would add, can I add something? I would add that for the Netherlands, one of the things that's difficult with the whole notion of rural, you know, how do we make a difference in the rural parts? I mean, there are lots of rural parts. I mean, the countryside where there were towns and villages influencing change there takes longer because obviously the activism to reach those places, when there's no power that concedes anything without some sort of demand. And unfortunately, fortunately, I think that the anti-racism movement in the Netherlands is continuing to grow. And it reaches further and further out into the countryside. But back to the gentleman's question about diversity and inclusion, what some of the things, that's a really big buzzword phrase right now, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think what we need to add to that is justice. That's one of the first things that you mentioned in your presentation was about justice, social justice. It's not just about diversity, which tends to come down to numbers and representation. I have how many people of color in my office, but it's about valuing the differences between your workforce. What do you really know about the different cultures that are represented? How do you celebrate those cultures? What is it that you do to support, as we were talking about development and funding, to support your workforce that could very well be in the Netherlands, predominantly, especially in the corporate sense, disproportionately white, but there's a growing number of people, non-white people who are also still marginalized because can be excluded because their name seems to have an ethnic background. So there's microaggressions that happen in very many ways. I think companies are starting to become more aware, especially since the global pandemic and since the Black Lives Matter movement has expanded around the world, that it is becoming a thing that we should be focused on. So I think that was a great question to ask.
Yeah, and I think it's also important we talk about Atlanta, right? What is Atlanta? like
well, you heard the song, right? It's not Atlanta, right?
Well, of course, they were in Cobb County.
I would like to do a book recommendation. I think everybody should read the book by Heather McGhee, and it's called The Sum of Us. And it's about zero-sum thinking. So looking at the world and life as a pie, so that if you have more, that means I get less. Whereas that's not how it is. If we all get better, we all get better.
That's right. That's right.
And the solution is social solidarity. So working together, building bridges. So read that book, Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us.
Well, that's what I was going to actually come to you, Yvonne, too, to end on this note. You talked about the fragmentation of Metro Atlanta because of intentional policies and movements to that effect still today. And we haven't really talked about the suburbs actually being, they're much more diverse than some people would like you to think. And Yvonne, you live in Johns Creek, right? And that's been one really interesting case study. But I noticed that you were planning to start a chapter of the NAACP there. Is that
We
right?
have,
Or have done
North
that?
Fulton NAACP.
Yeah, and
yes.
I'm just curious, what's your experience as an immigrant coming to that community that's growing in diversity and actually seeing a lot of progress?
The thing is this, to your point, Jennifer, there's a lot of diversity in Johns Creek and in Northern Fulton, but it's not inclusive. And inclusive means, diversity is you have shiny bits of all kind of colors, and you put them on a shelf, but you still make the decisions. Whereas inclusion is that you value the input of everybody. And what is happening in Johns Creek particularly, the proximity of having diversity does not mean that white people are able to, willing to, or for whatever reason, it's not happening. They're not having sustainable, meaningful relationships with people who are not white.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality.
Well, that's the reality throughout the entire metro area as
yes.
well. And we
what
need to
I
fix
do
that.
see in Johns Creek, though, and that was very prominent during summer of 2020, we had a big scandal going on in our city with our chief of police. And we have a lot of immigrants living in our community. There are 31% foreign-born people in Johns Creek.
Wow.
And that's a lot, right? And not all of them can vote, but they're residents. And what we would see traditionally is that immigrants, and I used to be one of them, I would just put my head down and I would just kind of listen, but I didn't feel that my opinion was something that I was allowed to voice because I'm not American. And I've learned that that is absolute nonsense. Besides that, what I see, and that is important, is that the kids of immigrants, they are breaking away from that notion that putting yourself in a corner. At the city council, those kids were leading the charge. They were very vocal, and their parents might be like, "Oh, just blend in, don't make a ripple." But these kids were there, and they would organize Black Lives Matter things, and they're running for office, and they're getting out the vote events. So that there is a change of people, the younger generation, saying, okay, my parents used to vote this, but I'm choosing to vote like that. And that is the hopeful part that I see in the suburbs.
Awesome.
That the kids are breaking away.
We finally coaxed another person into asking a question. So
yeah,
come on.
Kind of planned it. I'm her husband. But actually, this is not planned. No, like something that really struck me, and it might be naive, but that all the problems we have in the Netherlands, whether it's colonialism, it's racism, it's our issues with Indonesia, the Moluccan, it's all basically tied to colonialism. And if I look at how we deal with it, and how I perceive it at least, is that sometimes there's this discussion about the golden age. Can we call it golden age? It spurs up and it dies down. Then all of a sudden there's a huge emphasis on slavery, and then it flares up and it dies down. And now all of a sudden there's this huge debate about Indonesia and about the War of Independence, which we basically crushed and started the guerrilla war. It flares up and it dies down. So it seems that they're all fragmented narratives. And I'm wondering, should we as the Netherlands focus more on a bigger narrative that starts with us coming to terms with our colonial past? Is that what we should strive for? And Jennifer, I know this is your field. Or do you think all these separate, fragmented conversations will eventually evolve into a bigger narrative? Are we just not ready to really face our colonial past?
Jennifer,
Well,
that seems...
I think that's a great question. I don't see it as fragmented, to be honest. I mean, obviously, this is the work that I do, so I live it every day in some form. I see that it does have cycles where the emphasis, depending on what's happening at the time or what historical milestone we might have reached. But where we need to start is first educating ourselves, becoming aware and understanding these complexities of these histories. What's not just one-sided narrative, that there are other perspectives. And if you ask different aspects of society and generations included, you're going to get different responses. Exhibitions, of course, you're mentioning there are exhibitions that have been coming and going, but I in my perspective, I don't see it as fragmented. And I think there is not going to be just one narrative that or one-sided of a history, that we have to look at all of it in its complexities and come to terms with it. I mentioned about books. I highly recommend reading White Innocence by Gloria Wekker. It's in English and in Dutch. It starts with the notion that the cultural archive, 400 years of colonialism, has left its mark on our society in language, in culture, in knowledge production, and how we see ourselves. And I think the greatest challenge for Dutch society is to expand the view of itself as not just this civilizing nation that had the spice trade. I mean, we have this glory story that we're stuck on. It's not the only story. And I think that's the point, is that there are many narratives that need to be told, and they are being told. And that's the good news, that I think there's been a movement for a very long time that's finally really reaching a global level to make an awareness that the Netherlands is more than just a tolerant nation.
Yeah, there's sort of parallel going on in the South too. But I mean, I think we could also zoom out and see what has happened in the South as kind of an extension of a colonial period, right? Like I remember being in Barbados and learning that the first governors of the South of the Carolinas were British people from Barbados that came over to start the rice plantations there. And it's just these international connections I really never thought about before. And then of course, when you go to Fort Sumter, the place where the first shot was fired in the Civil War, they have big maps showing the agricultural trade with Europe. And it's something you don't really think about. You grow up with these binary narratives sometimes, and you don't connect it with the broader history. So I think that's our end note. We have to learn our history and learn everyone, an inclusive version of that history. And we have to know that we have individual agency, as Yvonne has told us, and we know that we're making progress in society, but also that we have things to do. So thank y'all so much for your time, for sticking with us. Appreciate it. I'm gonna have Derek come up.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. That's amazing. I couldn't write fast enough to take all the notes, and I'm not going to keep it long because we're over time, and some of you will want to go home for the State of the Union address or whatever you want to go home for, but it's kind of an important presentation as well, I guess. History is the present, Nathaniel. Those are the words that I think struck with me most. We had a few months ago conversations with Tamira here from the Rabobank, and we talked with them about how they address these type of topics in their company. And she called it, I think you called it, Tamira, courageous conversations. And I walked away from that meeting saying, that's what we need to do here. It's just face the music and have the conversation. And now that the conversation has happened, the word that I'm left with is empathy. I think first and foremost, the world needs a lot more of that. But you also asked the question, if not us, who? And if not now, when? I would add to that. So I think the idea of leading with empathy and looking at our history through an empathetic lens and taking that as a starting point in the present to think about what the future for the past is going to be, as Jennifer outlined it earlier on, I think is a really nice way of thinking about it. We have defined a mission which is not carved in stone yet, because we wanted to have a few of these conversations under our belt before we firm it up. But right now, the NAF Atlanta chapter is focused on building those bridges, but do that by enabling the exchange of people and ideas that create appreciation, progress, and tolerance. And we chose those words in that order specifically because there was an early conversation to start with tolerance, because in some ways and sometimes the Dutch pride themselves on that. And today we've heard, and many of us have learned, that that is a double-edged sword that we shouldn't lead with. Tolerance can be something we strive for, but we should never pride ourselves on having it, because I don't think that there can be enough of it. It needs to start with appreciation, and appreciation can come from empathy. From empathy can come progress, and hopefully we end up in a more tolerant world. And I think we all need that, and hopefully with enough of this first conversation, we can contribute to that, and then continue to contribute to it through future events. So for me now, it's over to the thank yous and the closing out. So I'm going to put my midlife readers on again, and thank everyone. First and foremost, thank all the speakers. Jennifer, I don't know if you're still awake. It's bloody late in the Netherlands,
I'm
but
still here.
very cool to have you here today. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Thank you for taking us through your wonderful presentation. I feel more at home now in Atlanta, and my wife will tell you that means a lot, because I don't always feel like that, but just learning about my own, adopted backyard is really fantastic. Yvonne and Laurens, thank you very much for joining the panel as well and sharing your perspective with us. We truly appreciate it. And then lastly, Trevor, the way you weaved all of this together, I never know if it's wove or weaved, but that's my Dinglish. But the way you did that with a good sense of humor and self-depreciation is something that I personally really appreciate. So thank you for that as well. Then our co-hosts at the Carter Center, Paige, thank you again personally, as well as the Carter Center as an organization for hosting us here. I don't think we could have picked a better environment really to have this conversation on a day like today with everything else that's going on in the world. And Lisa, I don't know where you are, but helping to organize this event here of the Carter Center organization is truly wonderful. Our sponsors, I mentioned them already, but look, we're just getting off the ground here. We're very proud to have 4 or 5 of them already under our belt after 4 months, but if we want to do more of this, then we will need more and more of them. So Rabobank, the main sponsor of today's event, Philips, Arcadis, Van der Lande, the Dutch Consulate, and of course the Carter Center through this wonderful venue. Thank you again. Couple of other items. This program here that you hopefully have all grabbed a copy of includes most of the books that were referred to by the various speakers. Maybe not all of them, but certainly quite a few of them. So if you weren't able to take notes of those, then you can find them there. Lastly, or almost lastly, I want to encourage everyone to become a member. There's various ways you can become a member. Just go to thenaf.org, which is the umbrella website of all the NAF chapters. When you become a member of the NAF, you can indicate the chapter, which is the Atlanta chapter, obviously, which means that your contributions will go to a very large extent, almost everything to the chapter here. There are sponsorship opportunities, individual family memberships, youth memberships, the whole jibanga. So don't forget to also spread the word. I think most of you are already members, but now we have 100. 100 can become 1,000 if everyone else gets another 10, right? So this is a member gets member request. Upcoming events, I just want to reiterate them again. We're really excited about a youth hackathon that Vincent and some other folks in our team are going to organize with a bunch of youth from different schools in May, focusing on solving some of the world's most pressing problems. It may be around plastic waste, but it could still change. But the principle is, let's bring the next generations in to help solve our problems. And I would suggest do that in an inclusive way that brings folks from all perspectives, coming from all different kinds of perspectives, not just age, to the table. Then we're going into the post-summer period, where around Atlanta Design Week, we're going to look at some of the design thinking and arts and design capabilities that the two regions, the Southeast and the Netherlands, have in common, and how we can build on that thinking. Some of the problems that the world is facing are very multidimensional, and designs thinking is a great way of thinking through those type of problems and looking for solutions. So that you'll see hopefully you know, why we started with this event and how the April event around the hackathon and then design in October will start to work together. And then later in the year, we have water management, which is going to be around solving one of the critical climate change implications of this world. And it's not just climate change, there's more to water management than that. But we're going to focus on that in January before we ring the year goodbye. So that's it from my end. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to reintroduce Miranda Reshaw to you all, who's going to close it all out with, I believe, another fantastic music performance. For all the speakers, we have some books here for you as a thank you gift for participating in tonight's event. Again, thank you very much. And to the audience, drive safe wherever you may be going. And to the virtual audience, thank you for joining us tonight. And press that send button if you want to share the recording with anyone else. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, so I'm going to close off the evening with a song that's also been very important in the civil rights and social justice movements. It is a song written by Bob Dylan, 1964, well known to most of you probably, and it's called Times Are A-Changing. And this is my debut on the ukulele, so forgive me if I make mistakes. Come gather around people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown. Accepted that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you'd better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. For the times, they are a-changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pens, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. But don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be one day to win, for the times they are a-changing. Come senators and congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he who gets hurt will be he who has stalled. And the battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and riddle your walls. For the times, they are a-changing. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command, and your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can. Lend your hand, for the times, they are a-changing. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be last fast. For the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last. For the times, they are a-changing. The times, they are a-changing. The times, they are a-changing. Thank you. Thank you. Have a safe trip home.
folks. in
Thank
case
you.
wanna raise your
Yeah,
hand.
definitely.
Guys, thank you
on
so
my iPad.
much.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you.
Really
Thank
great.
you so
Awesome.
much. This was great. Thank you.
Enjoyed it, man.